Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you all for coming. This is really exciting to see how many people of you are excited about this event. My name is Tana Fadl. I'm the Acting Executive Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice. And we are really excited about today's panel. We have a discussion, as you all know, about big data, racial equity, and transparency. And the event will be moderated by Rahsaan Hall, the Racial Justice Project Director at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And our panelists, he will lead our panelists, who are SJC Chief Justice Ralph Gants, Felix Owusu from Harvard, who's an economist and a PhD candidate, and Lynsey Heffernan, the JDAI Project Coordinator at UIS. Without further ado,
Thank you very much, and I appreciate this opportunity to be with you all today, and good afternoon, everybody. This is such an important conversation on data, but specifically data in service of racial equity. When Senator reached out to me about this conference, this panel, there was not any way that I could say no, and then when she told me the lineup, there was even more reason for me to not say no. The only reason that I thought of saying no was because I'm not really a data person, but I figured as a law reform advocate, specifically as it relates to racial justice and criminal law reform, there are some things that I think are particularly important for those of us who are advocates to keep in mind, specifically when we're looking at juvenile justice and the way that our young people are treated within the criminal legal system. Part of the problem, though, is the lack of robust data being used and analyzed to help solve some of the problems, or at least identify some of the problems and then work towards solutions. So that's why I'm honored to be a part of this panel and kind of give some brief framing through one specific example. There are times in life where the law does not always match up with reality. Here's the situation of a young man, University of Virginia, Marquise Weeks, who capped off this 100-yard kickoff return for a touchdown. And when reporters asked him about it, he said, well, that was just instinct, kind of like running from the cops. And it's just like, yeah, it's funny till it's not. But here, Mr. Weeks did this amazing job of running back this kickoff, not being tackled or caught by any of his opponents, and because no one could catch up with him. Fortunately, here in Massachusetts, the law has caught up in some respects with the reality of what people in communities of color particularly face. And I'll talk a little bit about the Commonwealth v. Warren case that folks may be familiar with. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about an ACLU report that relied on data called Black, Brown, and Targeted that was issued in 2014. This report, Black, Brown, and Targeted, collected data. There had been a history of community complaints about Boston police and the way that they interacted with people in communities of color. So the ACLU sent a public records request, and the response that we got from the Boston Police Department was that it was going to cost us $112,000 for records. So we came up with a compromise to do an independent study, have scholars and now analyze the data, and the goals of the study were looking at the ways in which police officers document stops, frisks, searches, the nature and scope and supervisory review of any of those stops, the impact, if any, of race on the stops that occurred, and the instances of stops and searches in different locations through the city of Boston. And we looked at data from 2007 to 2010, and there are 200,000 or so BPD reports of police-civilian encounters called FIOFs, or Field Interrogation, Observation, and Frisk reports that reported all of these interactions where people were stopped by the police, searched by the police, frisked by the police, or observed by the police. And what it revealed was that blacks in the city of Boston were subjected to 63% of those encounters, even though we made up just 24% of the city of Boston. And so here are some pie charts that just kind of give you a visual of what that looks like. You see black people making up 63% of the stops, yet the Boston black population is 24.4%. When you look at the communities where there are the highest concentrations of those stops, you'll see the darkest area, the dark blue, is Roxbury. And then next to that is Dorchester. And here are the reasons for the stop. The biggest one being the amorphous 75% of investigate person. And usually that could be a good reason for stopping someone if you had a little more detail to go along with that. But if it's just investigate person, we have no idea what that is, if there's probable cause for the interaction, or less than that, reasonable suspicion. And the nature of those offenses, you see the more concerning offenses like firearm and gun make up just a small sliver and fraction of the nature of why people were being stopped by police to begin with in the first place. And in these arrests, or not arrests, but in 97.5% of these interactions, there is no documented seizure or recovery of contraband. So in essence, this is just really bad policing because you're stopping or observing folks who aren't necessarily committing crimes. And so that brings us to the Commonwealth v. Warren. This is a case that arises out of Roxbury in 2011. A young man in Roxbury was home. He heard something going on in his room. He came in his room. He saw an individual in his room. And when that person saw the young man, he immediately leapt out the window, and the young man and his mother called the police. They reported that a backpack was missing with a laptop and several hats. The young man also relayed to the police that when he looked out the window, he saw the individual who was just in his room in the company of two other people, one of whom had a red hoodie and the other who had a black hoodie, all black men, and they went in the general direction towards Seaver Street. And so the police officer who responded took that information, circled the area for several minutes, and then, close to a half hour away or later in time, and about a mile away, he sees two individuals walking, one of whom had a hoodie on, and he approaches them and attempts to stop them, and they took off running through the park. So this officer, Louis Anjos, calls for backup. Another officer, Christopher Carter, responds to the other side of this park, sees one of the young men, Mr. Warren, coming out of the park, and he says, "Hey, stop," right there. He gives this command to stop. Mr. Warren sees the officer and takes off running. And then later, Officer Carr ultimately apprehends him, and somewhere within the immediate radius of where Mr. Warren is stopped by the police, there is a firearm recovered. At the trial court, his attorney, Mr. Warren's attorney, filed a motion to suppress to keep the gun out because his position was the police had no reason to stop him. And the trial court did not allow that motion to suppress. At the appellate court level, because his attorney took the case up on appeal, the appellate court also agreed with the trial court that Mr. Warren did not have a basis for making this motion to suppress. But one of the judges who wrote the dissent, Judge Agnes, pointed out, in addition to understanding the local geography and particularized suspicion, a page of history about encounters between young black men and the police in Roxbury is worth a volume of logic. And he cited to the ACLU's 2014 report of Black, Brown, and Targeted. This case ultimately went up to the SJC, and for those of you all who can't tell because of my complexion, at this point I'm blushing because I'm in front of the Chief Justice of the SJC. And so within, on review of this case, and again, this is a very scaled down version, particularly to the point of raising why data matters. The SJC unanimously overruled the lower court decision and determined that the police lacked reasonable suspicion for the investigatory stop of Mr. Warren. And they went through several steps of analysis, thank you, looking at whether or not he matched the description. And they held that nothing from the vague description to the point Officer Carr sees Mr. Warren transformed the defendant from a random black male in dark clothing traveling the streets of Roxbury on a cold December night into a suspect in the crime of breaking and entering. They talked about the proximity and the distance that Mr. Warren was from the house. They talked about the absence of other people when Mr. Warren was apprehended by the police, because there weren't very many people on the street at 9:20 on a cold December night. And these are things that can be considered as factors, but when you look at the totality of all of them, it does not necessarily rise to that level. And then looking at the issue of flight, and of particular note was the court's reliance on the ACLU's 2014 report to address Mr. Warren's flight from the police, noting that black men in the city of Boston were more likely to be targeted for police-civilian encounters such as stops, frisks, searches, observations, and interrogations. And, you know, for me as a black man in America, and for many people who do criminal law work on the defense side, who are committed to issues of racial justice, this quote from the case from Justice Hines is very moving and compelling, and its flight is not necessarily probative of a suspect's state of mind or consciousness of guilt. Such an individual, when approached by police, might just as easily be motivated by the desire to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled as by the desire to hide criminal activity. And part of Justice Hines' ability to say this is, one, her own lived experience as a black woman, as a woman who has lived in Roxbury, but also someone who has served as a public defender. But it is buttressed by the data that was put forward by the ACLU in our report. But we should not have to rely on happenstance or a lower court judge bringing this information up sua sponte or of his own accord to rely on this, as opposed to it being a part of affirmative litigation. So I say all this to say that the use, the value, the ways in which data can be used to transform the criminal legal system is so important. And I'm so glad that you all are here today to hear from these very esteemed experts who can talk about it in more detail. And hopefully, as we leave this place, we leave more inspired with the desire to dig deeper into the data, do greater analysis, advocate for more sets of data and more access to data so that we can really transform how we do justice in Massachusetts. Thank you. And now we will hear from Chief Justice.
Thank you, Rahsaan.
Welcome.
I knew him when he was just an ABA. I remember his closing arguments. The jury almost said amen. I thank you all. I thank especially Rahsaan for having invited me. I was heading back from lunch, and she saw me on the street, and she grabbed me and invited me. And said, whatever Rahsaan wants me to do, I do. Within reason. Within reason. So I do very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to speak briefly because it is meant to be a panel discussion. I'm going to seek to speak briefly. Few things that I want to speak about. First of all, it is incredibly important that we speak about matters of race, and as you all know, it's incredibly difficult for us to be discussing matters of race. I believe there's an article in the Globe yesterday or today, which asks how come we have such difficulty speaking about matters of race. I think we know why, but it is important that we do. It is important that we do so candidly. It's important that we do so respectfully. And it is important that we are willing to hear persons who may have different points of view from ourselves, because approaching issues of, if we cannot discuss issues of race, we cannot address the problems of race. I will tell you that in my 3.5 years as Chief Justice, voices have been raised, I think, only twice in my lobby, and both of them involved matters of race. I won't tell you what they concerned, but the fact of the matter is, these are important and difficult discussions which we need to have. As a court system, we are committed to having those discussions. We began in the spring of 2015. Perhaps Judge Listman has been tasked with correcting me with regard to all factual errors, but I think it was in the spring of 2015 that we had an all-court conference discussing what we at that time called implicit bias, I think what we're now calling unconscious bias, which is probably a better term. At the time, it was met with great interest by some and with some reluctance by others. At least one judge in the comments with regard to that conference said I was selected to be a judge by a black governor. The governor would never have chosen me if the governor thought that there was any implicit or unconscious bias. And of course, that was exactly the reason we needed.
Motion for reconsideration.
Sorry.
Motion for reconsideration.
The conference was important in terms of addressing issues and revealing the extent to which issues of race penetrate all parts of our judiciary. Of course, the one which is clearest is in issues of sentencing. There was, and the speaker had some rather dramatic data as the extent to which the blackness of one's skin affected the length of sentencing. Not so much in Massachusetts, because it was not focused on a single state, but when you hear that, you say, this is an enormous problem. If the shading of one's skin between how black you are is going to unconsciously affect how one deals with sentencing, is a matter that we need to discuss. We have been discussing it since. We have brought in consultants from the outside. We have had efforts in, I think, 4 courts to have pilot discussions. We're now trying to bring those discussions to the entire court. We are focusing in each of the court departments have had training with regard to matters of unconscious bias. It has been a subject for all who have been involved in developing sentencing best practices. There is a bench card now with regard to that particular issue. You sensitize judges with regard to it. We have a committee that's looking, the committee which is focused on eyewitness identification has been struggling with the issue of how you can address jurors with regard to issues of unconscious bias. It is, and we indeed have made it, we've requested money from the legislature as one of the 3 modules. We asked for a maintenance budget, we asked for additional modules. One of our modules is to continue our efforts with respect to issues of race and bias. We will continue it regardless of whether we get the module or not from the legislature, but it obviously would be better if we had those funds. So it is a matter of immense importance to we as a judiciary. It has been a matter that has been of particular importance, I should say particular importance, but is of importance to me, in part because of data. It was the Massachusetts Sentencing Commission data that I received, I guess now 2 years ago, which noted that although our rate of imprisonment in Massachusetts with respect to adults is one of the lowest in the country, the disparity among of incarceration in terms of the rate of incarceration between those who are white and those who are not is among the greatest in the country. With regard to African Americans, the rate of incarceration is nearly 8 times greater. With regard to Hispanics, it is 1.3, it is 4.9 times greater than it is for whites. And it would be one thing if that ratio were one that we saw throughout the country, but it turns out that Massachusetts has a disproportionately high percentage in that regard. So we are doing relatively well, although not well enough in my view, with regard to the overall rate of incarceration incarceration, but we need to take a good hard look as to why the rate of incarceration with regard to African Americans and Hispanics is so different. And as a result of that, I did ask Harvard Law School if it would conduct a study into matters of race, and it has agreed. Felix is among the crew who is on that. It turns out to be a very, very difficult thing to do, as he knows better than me, and I won't discuss it. It's still a work in progress. I basically have given it to them with the view that whatever you find, you find. Another principle that I think we have firmly established in our court system is it is what it is. We may not like what we find, but we will deal with what we find. So Harvard Law School can find whatever it will find, and when they do so, we will deal with the results. We've been focusing not only on issues of race, but also on issues of class. We had a quite terrific program on poverty, not seen by enough judges, but that is also an area that we need to spend more time on to understand the extent to which issues of poverty, whether it be poverty that derives from generational poverty, or poverty that results from discrimination, or poverty that results from situations such as health issues which pull people into poverty, create people's understanding of things which may differ from how we may perceive them, understanding how one views the world, both because of the color of their skin or the nation where they're from, or how much money they have, or matters which judges, and for that matter, magistrates need to have. And we've also been looking at issues with regard to how we treat individuals, including not only judges, but also magistrates and clerks at the desk, information officers. It is as important that we sensitize those individuals to issues of race as it is that we sensitize judges. But it is important to also recognize that when one looks at this data with regard to the disproportionate involvement of persons of color with regard to our juvenile justice system, and differential rates with regard to arrests and those who are detained, it is important that we remember that it is more than the courts who matter with regard to that issue. I note that I am here, but there's nobody from the police who are here. There's no one from the DA's office who is at least up here. There we are. Okay, good. That's important. Because the fact of the matter is, it's the police who decide whom to arrest. It's the DAs who decide whom ultimately to prosecute. A judge has the authority before arraignment to dismiss a case before arraignment to avoid that person being included in the carry, have a carry record, but only if the judge finds there's no probable cause. Decision issued a few weeks ago, which I wrote, and I know you don't like, but ultimately decided that the separation of powers means that if a prosecutor decides that the prosecutor wishes to proceed with an arrest, the power of a judge to dismiss it is before arraignment is based only on a finding of no probable cause, not on a finding that the judge does not think it to be wise or appropriate for that case to proceed. That case also focused on the expectation that we need prosecutors to think long and hard about such things. All or nearly all of the DA's offices do have programs with regard to pretrial detention. For pretrial diversion, I should say. And I don't know if anybody's keeping data with regard to those. And those are all data which belong to the DAs, and it's important that they be part of this discussion as well. And also, it's important that we bring in court magistrates to that discussion. One of those cases involved an individual complaint made to a court magistrate with regard to a juvenile. The magistrate decided to proceed. We said that a judge does have the authority to review that magistrate's decision as to the wisdom and appropriateness of going forward, but only if the DA does not essentially adopt it as his or her own. So the role of the court magistrate is incredibly important. In my remaining minute, let me speak a little bit about issues of data. There is no doubt that data is important. There's also no doubt that the data is not as good as it should be. And I can say that not only with regard to the juvenile courts, I can say it with regard to all of our criminal courts. We are working on it. It is still a work in progress. I often am disappointed by the extent to which the data that I want in order to analyze matters are not available. The mass court system essentially is a case management system. It was not necessarily designed to be designed for data analysis. We are attempting to adapt it to that purpose. It is not a perfect adaptation. And so as we move toward mass court 2.0, we know that we need to be better at having data that we can use for purposes of analysis and data we can rely upon. Because the other limitation of our data is only as good as the person who puts it in. So if we don't have a great deal of confidence with regard to whether the data is accurate, our ability to evaluate data is thereby diminished. So with that, I will thank you again and introduce, I guess, Felix.
Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for having me and allowing me to speak on this panel. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very excited to see that there's such a big community of people who are interested in data and issues of racial disparities and injustice. It can feel a little bit isolating in academia, but coming out to places like this and seeing there's a broader community of people who are interested and willing to come out is inspiring and sort of keeps wind in my sails as I go back home and dig into data sets. So I appreciate being here. I'm just going to talk a little bit today about the role that academics and specifically people who are working in economics can play in thinking about racial disparities in the justice system and sort of more broadly, and then reflect a little bit on some of the work that I've done in the juvenile justice space and think about what we were able to accomplish and where the opportunities to do more would be and what it might take to get to this place where we were able to do more with data. So just to start with a little bit of my background, I'm a PhD candidate in public policy. My training is primarily in labor economics and econometrics, which is the statistics for economics analysis. And that might seem like an odd choice for somebody who's primarily interested in doing research on criminal justice issues and also racial disparities. And I'm here to make the case that it's actually not odd at all, and that it makes a lot of sense for this kind of training to be sort of more used in this space. I think of economics primarily as a set of tools, and I know in the public discourse it often has certain ideologies or beliefs attached to it, but primarily what economics training has been for me has been a set of tools and approaches to solving problems in the very messy real world situations where issues of racial disparities and justice live. And so we have a certain set of ways of approaching and thinking about problems, taking into account that we can't do things like run experiments like they might be doing in the science labs. How do you sort of say something and add order to the world in that kind of context? I think that's really where economic training has come to be very useful for me. I think the tools for working with data in those messy contexts are very important, and then also the frameworks provided for thinking about incentives and trade-offs and the kinds of decisions that people make when they're trying to sort of minimize their risk in their communities or in their businesses are useful. You hear them applied to certain types of questions much of the time, but there's no reason they can't be applied to these other kinds of contexts. And maybe in the Q&A or other times I can go into more specific contexts about times in which my thinking has been shaped or made different because I had these frameworks from economics to draw on. But I think the major upshot is that given the right data, people who have training in the quantitative social sciences have a lot to contribute to these kinds of conversations. This is especially true in a world where we see inequality across many different axes, and we want to think about race and sort of give it the due that it's required while considering that there are other sources of inequality, and being able to speak confidently about race is important. I think economics provides important tools for being able to do that. And I think that's especially important in a world where people have a vested interest in believing that racial disparities aren't a real problem or that they can be explained away with other types of explanations that they don't sort of exist in and of themselves. The rigor and frameworks that economics training provides, I think makes it a lot easier to speak to people who might not have the same prior beliefs as you, or that might not have the same sort of background as you, in a sort of common language that is one in which all of your assumptions are made explicit and you're very much speaking to data and empirical evidence to make your arguments. And I think that's really the strength in my mind of what economics is offering and why I chose to do that training, but continue to focus my substantive interests on issues of racial justice and improving the criminal justice system. And I think to do that kind of work as an economist, I think it takes a certain amount of humility when you approach these situations. We do have a certain set of skills that we can bring to these situations, but we're just one piece of the puzzle. And I think the way to do economics work that's going to be able to contribute in these contexts requires coming to situations recognizing that we are one piece of the puzzle and that we need to be in communication with people who are actually using, managing, and advocating within these institutions that we seek to impact and understand. And that's going to help us ask the right questions, make sure that we're looking at things that make sense. And it's also going to allow us to make sense of situations where trends are not always obvious from a data table that you have. The data that you'll have as a quantitative analyst is always necessarily going to be limited. And so recognizing and coming to these situations with a certain amount of humility and building around yourself a coalition of people is, I think, the only way that I've been able to be effective in this space. And that's why I've chosen to study in public policy, where people in the department are coming from all sorts of different spaces. And I can sort of bring my specific skill set to bear while recognizing that lots of people have other valuable things to offer. And so to tie this back to some work that I've done specifically around juvenile justice in Connecticut, I worked on a project recently, and I gave you guys, I think, in the handout some excerpts from this project, just a couple of quotes and graphs that I think highlighted some of the data work that we're able to do. I was involved in this project to be that puzzle piece of the person who can work with the data. The other people who were working on this project were people with legal training, which is of course essential, people with experience writing legislation that impacts the juvenile justice system, people with experience in corrections, in case management, and service provision that were also involved in sort of this process. And so I was sort of that one piece, sort of the hired gun for data analysis, and that's what they brought me in for. And I learned a lot in that process. The project was focused on trying to understand the impacts of Connecticut's recent push to raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction and to anticipate what might happen if they were to continue raising the age further. Just in the way of a little bit of background, Connecticut in 2010, I believe, started a push to raise the age at which you're automatically considered an adult in the eyes of the court. At first, it was people who were 16 and over, and they raised that age to 17 and over, and then 18 over, and over in stages. And the governor was actually interested in continuing that push to include 18, 19, and then eventually 20-year-olds in the juvenile justice system. And so we were brought in to do analysis, and I think that sort of highlights the role that we can have where there is an active policy conversation with open debates that can be informed by data, and then we can sort of have people with these appropriate skills leveraged to sort of add to that conversation and be sort of that piece. And so that sort of push was coming, I think, from science outside of my pay grade in the neuroscience space and psychological and the child development space about how the brain develops, and recognizing the fact that even though you might be 18 or 19, your brain is still growing and changing, and specifically the parts that are developing are the ones that might be related to decisions that could end you up involved in the justice system. So executive function, impulse control, delaying gratification, all these things that we think of are related to making good decisions. Those are the things that are still developing, and so taking that research, that was sort of the impetus for this kind of push. And we were sort of brought in to help with the logistics of what might be the implications of that happening. And I think some of the things I'm most proud about is that we were able to speak specifically on a couple of the threads of the policy debate that were open questions as to what the impact of this change could be by looking backwards and thinking what happened the last time that a similar change was being made. One of the major concerns that you hear, and I think this is just a general tough on crime general argument, right? That if you do something that makes the criminal justice system more rehabilitative and less punitive, people are going to engage in more crime, and you're going to see a crime wave, right? I think in a lot of different contexts, we hear a similar flavor argument. And we were able to look at their data after getting cooperation from a variety of different agencies in Connecticut and say that, last time when this change was made, you didn't see an increase in crime. You actually see arrests declining over this time period pretty drastically. And so this sort of, at least descriptively, right, not necessarily doing like a very academic causal analysis for anybody who might be academic in the room. We were able to say descriptively that these crime waves that people were worried about didn't materialize, and there's not really evidence to think that you should expect this crime wave to materialize if people are handled in a more developmentally appropriate way in the criminal justice system rather than just ratcheting up punishment as high as possible. Another thing that we're able to talk about is a concern that bringing older kids into this justice system would overcrowd it and lead to worse outcomes for the people who are in the system. And we found that even though the 16 and 17-year-olds were added and tend to be more likely to be involved in the justice system than younger kids, they actually, the size of the justice system didn't increase. And there's a graph that I have about people who were in detention, right? And you see that over that time period, that 16 and 17-year-olds were added, the size of the overall detention population decreased, right? So some of these major concerns we were able to say, without having to sort of make any sort of moral arguments or normative statements or what we should or should not be doing, say these concerns that people may have had did or did not materialize, and being able to add some sort of structure to that. I think there was still a lot more that we could have done. One thing that I have on the other side of the handout is some stuff about racial disparities, right? We were able to document racial disparities. And I think at this point, that's not a lot of news to anybody in this room, and hopefully most people in the country, that there's racial disparities in the justice system. And we're able to show that they seem to be getting more extreme as you get further and further into the justice system, to the point where you're looking at the point in time estimates of who's incarcerated on a given day, and you see that it's overwhelmingly Black and brown people. So we were able to document those things. One thing that I wish we would have been able to do more about, and would have required more data to be able to do, is to think about what are the mechanisms that are sort of leading to this cumulative disproportionality as you move further in the system, right? We weren't able to tie this back to specific policies, to specific actors, to specific decision points in the way that we would have liked to, and that was, I think, primarily a data limitation. And not necessarily the entire goal of the report, but we were able to sort of put on paper that disparities are real, and that data collection is going to be an integral piece of trying to figure out how we can address these issues. And this is all, so we still had limitations, even with, I think, one of the most committed and willing partners that I've ever worked with in terms of data. People in Connecticut, I think, went above and beyond a lot of what I've seen before, and we're able to get data, and we also leveraged publicly available data to try and tell a rich story, and I think there's a lot left to do in that space. But I think I just wanted to highlight that given my training and sort of the background that people with a lot of quantitative skills have, it might not always come to these same issues substantively, but we are out there, and I think there is a lot of room for collaboration. It does require humility on our part, and to recognize that we are a specific piece of the puzzle, and conversation with people, and a certain amount of timeliness and responsiveness to policy conversations that are on the ground. I think with those things in mind, there is a lot of room for data and using data to try and answer these questions that I think are at the forefront of these conversations, and really do, at the end of the day, impact whether or not we are able to do what's right for youth when they're struggling, do what's right for our broader societies when we have these social problems to deal with. So I'm going to end it there and hope that I can talk a little bit more about what I think we can do constructively at the end and during the Q&A. But thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lynsey Heffernan, and I'm with the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts, and I'm excited to be here today. This panel is incredible, so thank you to CfJJ for inviting me, but thank you to all of you for what you have to offer. I am here today to share a little bit about our story of working in the juvenile justice system, the data we have, the data we don't have, all of the imperfections that are out there, but how do we chart a path forward as best we can. I wanted to say that for those of you who maybe don't know what JDAI is, it's the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. Our goal is to figure out how do we collaboratively figure out how to reduce incarceration rates for kids, particularly detention rates for young people, and do that in a data-driven fashion. That requires that we are all together in this, and so that requires police and prosecutors and schools and defense attorneys and judges and lawyers and everybody to contribute their part in this process. What we have seen over the last 10 years is a marked decrease in the use of detention in Massachusetts. This represents, I think, 5 or 6 different decision points in our system over the last decade. Overall, juvenile justice, we're seeing a decline. And so there has been a 57% decline in detention rates, and that sounds awesome. So we can all go home, right? But unfortunately, it is not the case at all. When I'm excited to say those who are talking about police data, at that same time, we've also seen a 53% decline in arrest rates. So one of the arguments is often if you're not locking up the children, maybe they're out there committing more crime, and we're certainly not seeing that at any degree. But if we look into our data a little more carefully and with a really eye on disparity, and we disaggregate our data by race and ethnicity, what we find is a lot more troubling and frankly, a lot sadder for us as a Commonwealth. This data is detailed in admissions over the last 10 years at DYS. And so for all the children who come into detention, when we disaggregate them by race and ethnicity, what do we see? What we see is that while we've seen 57% declines for everybody, predominantly those declines have fallen towards white youth. White youth have declined by 70%, so they're that dark blue trend line, really fallen off a cliff, where at the same time, Black youth have seen reductions only of 55%, so about the average, and Hispanic youth only 32%. They're our largest growing population in detention today. So what does that mean? Our detention system is less representative and more disproportionate 10 years into doing the work that I do. What do we need to do? What is our real challenge? Massachusetts is ranked #1 in the nation by U.S. News and World Reports when we think about education and healthcare and the system that we provide for our children. And as was referenced by the Chief Justice, we have similar data in the juvenile world as we do in the criminal world. We rank 3rd in the country in terms of juvenile incarceration rates. So we don't lock up a lot of children, and that's great. But we are 46th in the country when it comes to equity in juvenile jailing. So when we compare our population of juveniles in Massachusetts to the population in this case, they are taking incarcerated settings, so either detained or young people, we rank 46th. And I think that's something we certainly shouldn't be proud of, but we also need to talk more about if we're gonna really address this and figure out how to fix it. So then you have to ask the question, why? Why is it getting worse, right? Don't we have good people in the system who have been working on this and who have been trying to figure this out and really at the forefront? Is it that we have bad people in the system who actually want to lock up children of color? I think it's that we've been asking the wrong question, and we've been therefore putting in the wrong solutions. They're helping white youth while at the same time making it much harder for youth of color to figure out ramps off and out of the juvenile justice system. So I want to tell you a story that helped me understand what it was that we were doing wrong. And this was written up recently in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And what they called it was the curb cut effect. Right? So I want you to imagine 1970s, Berkeley, California, young people who are in wheelchairs. There are no curb cuts in Berkeley in 1970. They don't exist. And young people who are in wheelchairs who had to be housed actually in a former hospital because there was no way for them to get around the campus well, in the middle of the night, literally, went out and poured an illegal curb cut, poured a bunch of concrete such that they could get access to the one sidewalk in the community of Berkeley. 2 years later, the community of Berkeley actually put in some sidewalk curb cuts. And in 1999, almost 30 years later, President Bush signed the ADA mandating that we have curb cuts for people who have mobility issues, right? So the curb cuts were designed for this guy, right? We want to help him get to where he needs to go. But who uses the curb cut? Delivery people? Bicyclists, the little kids, definitely want them on the sidewalk, right? You don't want them on the street. The strollers, right? The big strollers. I'm a mom with little kids. We have those. We see that skateboarders, they're using them a lot. Those business people with our stupid bags and those people going to court, those really big bags, you're using it. The best part, 9 out of 10 unencumbered pedestrians, you and me, walking on the street with nothing. We're gonna go to the curb. We like the curb cut. Turns out to be better for all of us, right? So what does this story tell us? It's this notion of thinking about equity versus equality. Because what I hear from people is that I treat everybody the same. I do a good job. The people who come into our court get the same service, and that's good, and I'm saying that's not good enough. Because that notion really is this notion of equality. Everybody gets the same, no matter who you are or what you look like. So some of you may have seen a version of this graphic. The idea here is that you have young people who want to be able to see over a fence to see a baseball game. But the young people are not all the same. In my world, they're green and orange and gray. I don't know why that's the colors scheme that I chose, but and you have the green young man who gets a box, right? He doesn't need a box. He never needed a box. He could see the game just fine. The person who is orange gets a box, but again, only needed that one. But what about poor little gray dude? Little gray dude can't see even though you gave him a box. By giving everyone the same thing, we actually didn't help to get rid of the disparities that began with in the system. So the notion instead is to move to equity. And equity is this notion. And when you think about it, go back to the curb cuts, right? Not to be confused with formal legal equality conferred by landmark laws such as the Civil Rights Act. Equality gives everyone the right to ride on the bus. Equity ensures that there are curb cuts so people in wheelchairs can get to the bus stop and lift so that they can get on the bus, and ensures that there are bus lines where people need them so they can get to where they need to go. That's what we need to do in the juvenile justice system. So when someone says to me, I treat everybody the same, I say, that's the problem. And we need to figure out how do we treat people based on the needs that they're presenting with and fill those gaps. What was said really well by John Powell, thinking about the notion of targeted universalism, the same idea. Treating people who are situated differently as if they were the same can result in greater inequalities. And yet it's the notion that I hear in our rhetoric, I think that I hear throughout the justice system, because justice is colorblind. And I don't believe that, but that is the notion that's put out there and gets us into the problems that we have where 10 years later I'm telling you, we made it worse, right? And that, again, good people in the system, but we weren't looking at the problem the right way. So when I think about who's responsible for our data, I could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different people, right? We could talk about the medical community and begin with birth weights for youth of color versus white youth, or who gets access to early childhood and prevention services. We see disparities there. We absolutely see disparities in the schoolhouse in terms of discipline and special education services. We see disparities in terms of drug use. Who gets services? My friends at the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services come to me and said, how come in our service continuum we serve more white youth? I said, oh, black kids stopped using drugs. No, that's not the answer, right? Who gets in there though? Who gets referred? That's a problem of ours. We think about the child welfare system, and without a doubt, they are a piece of this. Who gets called with 51 A's? We'll see big disparities just if you look at one hospital. Who do they call on? Right, so the problem is complex. Is there a problem at law enforcement? Yep, as there is in every other one of these points, right? And who gets arrested? Black youth tend to be 3 times more likely than white youth to be arrested in Massachusetts, and Hispanic youth 2.5 times more likely. But you can continue when we get to the doors of the courthouse and perceptions of fairness and what we see, who gets incarcerated, who is ultimately in our facilities, and our data is not really any different than what was cited before on the criminal side, on the adult criminal side, but that we see that we have a disparity of somewhere between 8 and 9 times more likely for a young person of color to be in DYS's facilities than white youth. So that's a problem, right? It's a problem though for all of us, right? And to figure out how are we going to solve that collaboratively and how are we going to pull ourselves together and avoid blaming each other for it, but figure out what's the solution, right? But where are we going to go from here? What I want to spend just a minute talking about though is what does this mean in the eyes of adolescent development, right? Because this piece is important. And the justice system is supposed to be about accountability, right? And we want to rehabilitate young people. So I want everyone to think about a young person that you care about in your home right now, previously in your home, your grandchild, who does something wrong. Like wrong, whatever in your brain is wrong. And is the first thing that you do ground them for a month? Is that your first response? No, right? You're going to have your own little system of graduated responses. That's what we want to call those now, right? Your graduated response is going to be first, we're going to redirect them with something positive, and then we're going to work on their peer groups, and then we're going to put in a more minor sanction, and ultimately we might ratchet our system up, right? Because we know that saying that youth should be held accountable is not the same as saying that they should be punished. That doesn't make sense when we come to teenagers. We all want accountability. None of us are interested in like rampant gangs of teenagers running around causing disorder. That's not our reality, though. And instead, what we really want to think about is it doesn't follow, right? That the mechanisms of accountability need to be punitive, or that they should in any way mimic criminal justice ones. So what adolescents want, right? Fairness, which is hard. Even though our system is designed to dole that out, right? Adolescents need to know that they are heard. They need to know that their opinion is respected. They need to know that their decision maker is neutral and not biased. And when I say decision maker, don't just read and judge. Like teacher, parent, right? When your child thought that you were being unfair to one child versus the other, you heard about it, right? They have an insane and really finely tuned sense of justice. And given teenagers' drive for autonomy, this makes sense, right? This is why they do. That they're really sensitive to a system that might be unfair. Why does this matter to us? Because we also have research that tells us if juveniles perceive a system to be unfair, they're not going to take any of the rehabilitative offerings that we have for them. They're going to say, thank you very much. You're a whole bunch of unfair adults who aren't listening to me. And so I can throw any MST, FTT, any great program out there, but if I've got a kid who thinks that I'm an unfair actor in this system, no thank you, I'm not going to listen to you. So what do we know when we look at kids in the system? And this is national data. When surveyed by researchers and we ask about the fairness in the juvenile justice system, youth of color consistently rate the system as less fair than white youth. So should this matter to us? What we know is that those are really tied to their actual individual interactions. My teacher referred me to the principal's office and that wasn't fair. That judge, that officer, that's what gets them and they're gonna hold on to that. Right? Not so much actually the length of their punishment. They'll accept their punishment if they thought we were all fair in the process. Right? So what we know, we're not gonna do this because I don't think we're out of time. What we know is that trying to figure out how to talk about race is really difficult. Right? And so some of the ideas of why it's difficult are up here, but we're pulling together people in the state of Massachusetts to try to have these conversations, to get through what we call the analysis paralysis, right? I need more data, because I need more data, because I need more data, because I don't understand your problem, I need more data. It's not helpful, we're done. We know there's a problem, let's move on. How do we get over the culture of politeness? I will say 10 years ago when we talked about collecting data by race, that was anathema. To many partners in the system, because we don't want to be rude. Talking about race is like talking about religion at Thanksgiving. You don't do it, right? We got to get over some of that, over the distraction, the defensiveness, and the blaming of others, and instead figure out how do we look internally, figure out what do we have to offer to folks. So I'll just end that what we know right now, youth of color are 32% of the juvenile justice population, yet they account for 70% of all detention admissions. That gets worse if I were to pull committed numbers. But that we need to collectively and collaboratively need to have conversations about race, ethnicity, disparity, and inequity. We're doing some of that through a trailer I didn't show you with a great film and discussions, but we're doing some of that and we're happy to talk to people more about that. But that for our young people, their perceptions of fairness is something that we really have to spend more time thinking about. Because otherwise I don't know why we're here, right? If we don't want to help fix the young people and give them better options and better future, but we've stacked the deck against ourselves, then we're investing an awful lot of money in a system that really isn't working for us. And if for no other reason, if it can't be morally compelling or compelling to sort of our sense of what is just and right, economics alone are going to give it to you, right? Youth of color, 2 years from now are going to be the majority of the population will be young people of color. In fact, this summer, young people's births, the births of people of color, were greater than whites for the first time in American history. And so our population is changing, and we certainly want these young people to be contributing members of society and not to get caught in this cycle. It's conversations like these that we need to have to figure out ways to move forward. So, thank you.
Thank you. And so with the remaining minutes, we'll just jump into the panel question, and I'll ask each of you the same 2 questions presented as one, and then if we have time left over, we'll take some Q&A from the audience. But what are your next steps in this work? Each of you all have talked about the things that you are doing currently, or some of the things that you are concerned or interested in. What are the next steps for you in this work? And is there an opportunity for the folks who are gathered here today from their various disciplines and backgrounds to be involved in that work? So I'll start with you, Chief Justice Gants.
It's not a short question. In terms of what things we are doing, we are focused on our work with regard to unconscious bias. We are focused on training of judges. We are focused on training of probation officers and court magistrates. We are, the juvenile court, I should say, especially since I've got Judge Harris and Judge Lister in front of me. Before other courts were focused on this issue, not least because of them, the juvenile court was focused on this issue. The issue of the school to jail pipeline was an issue which 10, 15 years ago was one which the juvenile court has taken a good hard look at. We well know that a kid who acts up in Newton is not going to be appearing in Newton District Court or in a juvenile court, but we also know that that same kid acts up in Brockton or Lynn or Roxbury, we are more likely to see him in a court because there are police officers in those schools who are in Newton, and because there is a view that you deal with the problem differently depending on where you are. The juvenile court has understood that for a long while. That really, I think, is bred in the bone, and I've been to enough of the juvenile court conferences to say that those issues, as well as issues with regard to problems in terms of transgender youth and whatever else, are all there. I will also say that the juvenile court is probably our second most stressed court. The first being the probate and family court in terms of the workload, because there's been a 40% increase in the number of care and protection cases that have hit the juvenile court. The numbers may not appear to be that great, but the amount of time and effort that is taken in a care and protection case, and by that I mean a case in which DCF is taking custody of a child, and there is a liberty interest involved, and there is a hearing as to whether or not the parents should retain control over that child. And that means that we need attorneys for each of them, and that is a problem we are having and struggling with, especially in the western part of the state. It also means there needs to be a 72-hour hearing and a subsequent hearing, and it means there needs to be findings of fact by a judge in writing, which are usually the longest decisions which we get in the appellate court, because they're decisions not about a single moment in time, but decisions about 3 lifetimes: the life of the child, the life of the father, the life of the mother. So that court has been dealing with all of those issues and is also struggling to be dealing with all the other issues that address them. But I will say, in terms of where we need help, we certainly need whatever help we can get in terms of being able to understand and analyze data. We are committed to both being transparent with regard to what we do, to looking at data, and to acting upon data. That is a commitment which is not only my own, but shared, I know, by Chief Justice Carey of the Child Court, Chief Justice Declan of the Juvenile Court. The extent to which we have people like Felix who are helping us to analyze that data and understand it are all matters that will help us to figure out what to do and where to go. And again, I'm going to stop there.
All right, Mr. Owusu, what is next for you, and what are the ways that folks in this room can help?
Yeah, sure. I will be working with the people at the Harvard Law School on the project, as Chief Justice mentioned, and so I'm looking forward to digging into that data and trying to understand the racial disparities in Massachusetts a lot better. So that's one thing that I'll be spending a lot of my time working on going forward. And another thing that I've been thinking about a lot is what are the sort of, how can we have done better or do better, thinking specifically about solving problems in the juvenile justice space. And I think the juvenile justice space faces a good number of constraints in terms of data, some of which are sort of general, and you could say about a lot of different sort of sources or social institutions, but some are unique to the juvenile justice space. Some of them I think are, real but surmountable. Obviously, privacy is a very big concern, and I think the technology that's available right now allows researchers to try and learn from data without compromising security or identity or anything like that of the people who are involved in the system and maintaining privacy. That is a challenge, but it is doable. Other things I think take a little bit more work to figure out. So thinking about the juvenile justice space, I think the biggest challenge in my mind when we're thinking about the Connecticut project is we have a lot of cool data from the courts. We were able to look at some publicly available arrest data. We were able to look at data on confinement and detention, and that was all great. But to really think about how we're doing right by our children, I want to be thinking about what's going on in schools. I know a lot of kids are, well, some people would call like multi-system youth, where they could be involved with child services, foster care, and other agencies. And so we want to be thinking about, are there other institutions that need to be brought into the conversation to actually address these disparities, right? Think about the school to prison pipeline, and how people are referred to the justice system might be very important. And being able to think about other impacts or benefits of policy reform, right? We don't want to just be stuck in the trap of saying, does this reduce recidivism, or does this reduce crime? Those things are very important. But being able to think about whether one way of approaching youth is less disruptive to their education. What's related to victimization of the people who are involved in the system themselves, physical and mental health, and a host of other types of outcomes that sort of their economic well-being. Those are all things that we want to think of, and those are things that can be impacted by what we do in the justice system, but those are things that we're currently not equipped easily in a lot of contexts to sort of talk about in conversation with each other. I'll close with I think one thing that I found very striking since really focusing on research in this area. I think a lot of the best research that's on the cutting edge in the criminal justice space is happening in places like Switzerland and Sweden. And at first I was like, why are all of these people like super excited about these countries, right? Not even the research aren't even from these countries. And then what I found out is that they are just a lot better about keeping and managing their databases. They proactively link databases from different social agencies, and they do that ahead of time and not suddenly when there's a problem that requires answering it. And so when there's a question that needs answering, people are able to hit the ground running and work with established databases, and they're good about making those things available to researchers who want to commit. I think the United States has a lot of unique issues that make doing research here very important, that make it doing it in Massachusetts and everywhere specifically important, especially with regards to racial disparities. And so I think we should be able to answer those questions here and not just in other countries. I think there are models out there for how we can do better. It just requires us to be proactive so we can have timely answers to policy questions that are sort of impacting the conversation today.
All right, Ms. Heffernan, what is next and what folks do to help?
I appreciate that the last time I had a conversation with an economist, he said the exact same thing to me. That's your data sets. And I said, oh boy. So there are an awful lot of things that I think we are doing, and we are the people that are involved in some of this collaborative reform work. I think we are trying to figure out how to have meaningful conversations on race, how to train up people to get over some of those barriers, and that I wouldn't want to minimize as a huge task. We are trying to be aware of our own internal distractors. Right? What I mean by that are those things in our head that sometimes make us shut down, that say, oh, that's not really about me, it's about somebody else. Maybe it's about you, right? And how do we keep it on ourselves? And so when I find myself sitting at my desk, and I do often looking at data saying, if only fill in the blank agency would do their part, my world would look different. This is another kind of blaming, right? It is not super productive because we have a lot of responsibility. For instance, in my agency, the Department of Youth Services, we control where kids eat, sleep, breathe, and go to the bathroom, right? And so what is it that we're doing to look internally so that we can authentically go to the community and say, this is the work that we're doing? I think we're trying to figure out how to do a better job engaging particularly youth and families to be part of these conversations. And that's a piece of work for us really in 2018 to figure out what do young people say about the system that they're in, what do their families say about it, and what can we do to really improve their perceptions, going back to perceptions of fairness about how we are doing our work. We will continue to be as transparent as we can with the data that we have. Those of you that haven't seen our data, please go check out our website. It's mass.gov/JDAI. We have every county for 4 years, arrest data by county, and numerous different decision points. And so there are things that are out there that we'll continue to keep doing. And I think what we probably need from all of you is we need a little bit of pressure to keep the public accountability on us, right? That while I think there are really well-intentioned people strategically placed in leadership across lots of different sectors right now, there's always another fire, right? And there's always another problem. And this problem just needs constant monitoring and attention. And so forcing us to stay true to what I'm saying today and say 3 years from now, are you really doing it, is I think a fair call to everyone here. For those who think my community should be having these conversations, I'd suggest 2 things to you. One, we're happy to come and host a screening of our film and have a discussion in your agency, interagency, at your school system. We've trained up a lot of facilitators now and are in a position to do that. We also would invite you to come to the table and be part of the conversations locally. And if you don't know if there's a conversation locally, go back to our website because it's all up there, mass.gov/JDAI, and come and tell us what you think needs fixing, because we need good people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and really help us.
Thank you all. And so with the remaining time, I'm going to try to get to some audience questions, and that's going to be determined by how many questions there are as opposed to comments and statements. That said, I'm going to take a moderator's privilege, and even though I wasn't asked, one of the things that's next for me is working on the public education campaign about educating people about the role and power of district attorneys. You can visit our website, www.dadifference.org, as we're talking about the collection of this data and how it gets used and how policies are influenced. Prosecutors have a very meaningful and significant role to play. Now, that said, I'd like to see a show of hands of all the people who have questions. There we'll begin to field those questions, and then let's see how many we can get to. Okay, Judge Blitzman.
All right, so my question is, and this follows up on what Mr. Owusu said. Are you a professor yet?
No, I'm still a PhD candidate.
Okay. I think the elephant in the room that we're not talking about is structural racism. Not that unconscious bias is an easy conversation. So the question I have is, I totally agree about the idea of getting other systems, primarily school community. But if we're talking about schools that are as segregated as they were at the time of Brown, we're talking about residential segregation, which is de jure, not de facto, through housing policy. If we're just talking about the court piece, it feels like we're just chasing our tail. So I'd love to hear anybody respond to that, because I think this is very structural.
I'll give you the background.
I don't think, Judge, I wouldn't disagree with you at all. And I sort of suggest that to a lot of folks that I talk to that there are levels to this, right? We absolutely have to talk about individual biases that exist in individual decisions and what it is that goes on in my brain as I interact with somebody on the street. That matters. How do I then move in the world, and the decision-making power that I hold is sort of the next step. But what are the structures that have cabined such that I interacted with that person on the street in the first place, right? And so if I'm a police officer, why am I patrolling this one area versus another area? And I guess I come from a place right now, which has been ever evolving, that I'm going to meet people where they're at in that conversation. That there are lots of people who haven't accepted that there's anything going on in their brain that needs any work. And we're going to start with those people there. And then those who are ready to get to that next. Now, I would like a little more fire over here, because I think that's how we're going to solve a lot of big problems. But we have a lot of people in our community that I think that don't yet believe some of the data that I've shown, that don't believe that's an issue yet. And then there are communities who are crying out for us to make more progress. And it's getting to some of the structural issues that we're going to have to do if we're going to really turn the tide, I think.
Just a quick comment. Yeah, definitely structural racism is a big piece of it. And I think one of the strengths of the type of analysis that I try and read and hope to be able to work on going forward is thinking about what are the ways that, on their face, race neutral policies can be actually sort of, ones that actually perpetuate racial disparities in a lot of ways, and trying to think about how we can anticipate those things, and also because of the incentives and around all this kind of stuff, how can we anticipate how people work around different kinds of things. I think having studied a little bit of education policy history, hearing the history of busing and all these different ways, different types of lotteries, community schools, all the ways that people have tried to sort of break around those things. Maybe hindsight is 20/20, but I think one of the things that we can do is learn from these past lessons and say, even when we try and explicitly work around these things, people find a way, right? People find informal ways, and people find sort of policy, sort of formal ways to do it. But I think there is some work to be thinking about incentives and like what options we give to people and what can we do to empower people to try and break around these structures. Because I think a lot of the most obvious things that people have tried or that I've heard about or that I thought of until somebody later told me it's actually not a good idea to work around these structures. They're sticky in a way that is, shocking. So that, I think there's a role for researchers to try and intervene there and figure out where the real structures are and why some things, the dismantling those structures, don't seem to have the impact we think they do.
Great.
Okay. I really appreciate, Lynsey, what you were saying about bringing young people into this conversation. I'm just wondering if the other folks on the panel would like to, how can we bring young people into this conversation? Because I think that there's a lot of really great things are being said, but are there trainings that are happening by young people in a court level? Are there, how can we create research opportunities for young people to be able to engage in this and then be empowered to be able to be part of the change of structural racism?
So I think one of the main things one of the reasons why it might not be obvious to people that economic training should be or could be useful in all these spaces is because of who is in economics at this point. If you've never been to the economics department at Harvard, there's a spiral staircase of prominent economists and it's just white men. And you walk up 4 flights of stairs and it's, and that's why I think I made that point early on about economics often has an ideology associated with it, but that's not core to the disciplines, right? You can use it for other things. What I've tried to do is be that example who can sort of do the rigorous math stuff, take the courses and be in these spaces, but then still have an interest in these substantive issues and work to try and better communities that don't actually have this access a lot of the time. That can take the form of also mentoring and trying to show people that there are other ways to do this, right? I think a lot of people who want to make a change think I can be an activist, I can be a politician, or I can get rich enough to try and sort of buy my way out of it. But there are sort of different paths for that. Being a policy analyst is one. There's a program called PIA, Public Policy and International Affairs, and it's for people who are in college and to try and expose them to the benefits of doing policy analysis and trying to think about using data to try and better inform policy sort of as a person working in that space rather than some of the other routes. I think there's a lot of things that need to be done to sort of do that, but I do think, honestly, by just changing the group of people who have access to this training and skills and how comfortable they feel while they're getting that training to make sure that they actually persist is an important step that has to happen. And it's going to take it's going to have to start all the way in elementary school, I think, to really get there, but I'm sort of getting in where I can, given where I'm situated.
You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Chief Justice Gants. I was wondering if you could give us a little more information on the module you were talking about that you're trying to get from the legislature.
It's a module seeking about $600,000 with regard to developing our efforts to build on the efforts that have been done, which have been focused on, I think, 4 courts in terms of discussions and to try to scale that to the entire court system. Part of what we're trying to do is to have these discussions, and the question is, how can what is learned in the discussions that have been had in 4 communities, Lawrence, Rochester, or Roxbury, I forget, and I forget the other 2, how we can bring those discussions to the entire court system. So it is something we are committed to be doing. We've been bringing in consultants to help us. It turns out that consultants don't exactly speak the same way the rest of us do. There is a divide in terms of how the academic world deals with this and how people, judges and such, and clerks and such deal with it. So even when you have those discussions, there is a question of on what plane. Ultimately, I am convinced that jargon is the enemy of good sense and of analysis, that we need to get past the jargon. I'm also convinced, and picking up on something which I think was asked earlier, one thing which I do not know, and again, I'll defer to those who have spent combined probably 40 years as juvenile court judges. When I go to a juvenile court conference, I am extraordinarily impressed, and I mean it quite sincerely, with the extent to which these are judges totally committed to kids. They care very, very deeply about kids. I don't think you become a juvenile court judge unless you do care deeply about kids. But I think it is also, and again, I look to them to correct me, the context of the discussion that you have as a judge with a kid is a little bit different than the kind of discussions which you're hoping we're going to have, because some share of them, if it's a delinquency matter or a youthful offender matter, they have the assistance of counsel, and the counsel is not necessarily going to be anxious for the child to be speaking candidly to the judge. And in other settings, they know they're in a court setting. One area where and I'm focused on this right now, primarily in the area of civil justice and access to justice, understanding how people see us is an incredibly important thing for us to see, and we're not that good at that because people won't necessarily tell us how they see us because they worry about what the particular consequences might be. But that is something which you collectively can help us with. I think it is incredibly important that we understand how people see what we do, because that's how we learn to do things a little bit differently. I am struck when I see the number of the fact that the great reduction in detention is focused on white youth. Do I worry that judges, likely unconsciously, don't give up on white kids as often as they might give up on kids of color, because they understand them, because they're more likely to have parental or other support. And so we need to basically make sure that we just can't give up on kids, because every kid we give up on is going to be a kid we're going to be seeing later as an adult. And then the fact of the matter is, we need collectively to begin to view ourselves as strong as each of the individuals are. If we lose 5 or 10% of our population, we are weaker as a community. We simply can't give up on persons who are struggling for all kinds of reasons, whether it be issues of nutrition or issues of poor schooling or issues of drug abuse in the family or issues of mental health or issues of homelessness. Those are all issues, perhaps not mental health, but other issues more likely to be suffered by kids of color. We simply can't give up on them. We need to understand better how those problems affect them, and we need to work harder to make sure that we don't lose them. So
at this point, I ask everybody to give our panelists a round of applause.